Have you ever felt like reality is more like a movie set than the whole show? What if the world we think is solid is actually a multi-layered hologram, and we're only seeing the surface? Today, we're diving into the ideas of Michael Talbot and exploring what they could mean for life, death, and consciousness itself.
What you're suggesting here is something I think if I can read into what you're saying, it has implications for science and for the scientific community.
We're locked in this apparently solid, substantive reality. The universe has many, many levels of reality. We just haven't accessed the level that shows us how profound and magical that reality is. What I'd like to do next is I'm working on a book that is the practical application of this holographic idea in all of its various phases. We've got to understand that we have this enormous capability, but our conscious mind feeds it all kinds of things unwittingly and gives it all kinds of mistaken directions. And I want to write a book that really deals with all these things on all kinds of levels, saying, here are the practical applications, how it ways it. You don't have to deal with the very sort of heady space-time aspects of these things.
Right after he made that on-air claim, he died in a way people called strange. His name was Michael Talbot, an independent researcher who said he'd cracked something deep about reality, that there are multiple overlapping worlds most of us can't normally see. Talbot's idea rattled some scientists. He argued the world we take for granted isn't the only level of reality. Parallel layers are happening alongside ours, and under the right conditions they bleed through. This wasn't just wild speculation. By the late 20th century, experiments in quantum physics, like the famous double-slit test, had already shown strange behavior. Particles behave differently when observed. That suggests the observer isn't merely watching from the outside. They're part of the system. Talbot didn't dismiss that as a fluke. He treated it as a hint, maybe even a doorway, to understanding multiple realities. So, was Talbot onto something, or did his ideas push him too far? In the next segment we'll look at the experiments, the skeptics, and the evidence Talbot used, and whether his sudden death changed how the scientific community responded.
Reality in a hologram can manifest in two ways, as a concrete image or as this sort of indecipherable blur of energy. An analogy to this is when you're watching Johnny Carson on your television set, that's really, his image is encoded in two ways. One is as the concrete image on the TV set, one is as the blur of radio waves permeating the living room. And if the universe is a hologram of some sense, in some way, it suggests that there may be two very drastically different levels to reality, that the concrete reality we see, when we look at these chairs and at the trees and the clouds and everything like that,
Our bodies
are just one way that reality manifests, and that at some deep level there's a level of reality where everything dissolves into an ocean of energy that is holographically interconnected, where every portion of the universe is contained in every tiny area of the universe.
From this point of view, reality isn't a single flat thing, it's layered. Each level of perception links to deeper layers, and together they form a unified field where the line between mind and matter starts to vanish. Imagine shifting radio stations. You don't stop existing when you change channels. You move to a different frequency. In the same way, death can be seen not as an absolute end but as a transition, a move from one layer of reality to another. This isn't just poetic speculation. It's a coherent framework that flips a basic assumption. Matter depends on consciousness, rather than consciousness being a byproduct of matter. For many viewers, that reversal feels surprising, even unsettling. That's also why some institutions took notice. The idea overlapped with secret and experimental research into altered states and perception places, where people try to deliberately change how they experience those layers. So, is the layered model real science, useful metaphor, or both? Next, we'll examine the experiments and field reports that made people take this seriously, and what it would mean for how we live and die. If that interests you, subscribe and leave a question below.
If you take two subatomic particles like electrons, in certain instances, when you do something to one, it will always affect the other, no matter how far apart they are. It's kind of like stories that you've heard of identical twins where when one is hurt, the other feels the pain. And the problem is that we can find no process known to physics that explains how these could be sending a signal back and forth. In fact,
Because it would have to be faster than the speed of light.
instantaneous. It would have to be an instantaneous signal, and Einstein's theory of relativity said you can't have instantaneous signals because it would mean that you could violate the time barrier and conceivably call your grandfather and tell him not to marry your grandmother. And most physicists say, well, this would be just too troubling to incorporate into a rational picture of reality.
Think about identical twins. Countless stories describe one twin feeling danger or pain the moment the other is hurt, even when they're far apart. Those moments are hard to explain with ordinary physical rules. Michael Talbot pointed to a curious parallel in physics. Quantum experiments show particles can behave in linked ways across distance, what scientists call entanglement. Talbot asked a bold question. If tiny bits of matter can stay connected instantly, might minds be wired to the same hidden network? It's a speculative jump, but it's the kind of idea that makes you rethink isolation and connection. If the universe is holographic, where every part reflects the whole, then everything we experience is interconnected. Time, space, and matter might not be fixed. They could be flexible expressions of deeper laws we haven't fully mapped. Within that view, life and death stop being absolute endpoints and become points on a continuous spectrum where consciousness shifts between layers of reality. Talbot's ideas spread quickly, and then, just as the conversation grew louder, he died. Whether you take his framework as metaphor, hypothesis, or something more, the questions he raised keep pushing scientists and seekers alike to rethink the structure of existence.
At a deeper level, a very holographic level of reality, every particle in the universe collapses to a sort of cosmic unity. They're not signaling each other. They're like that fish where there's the level of the aquarium. And so what that means, talking about words, is that there is no separation between electrons. Furthermore, there's no separation between people. And this has all kinds of very boggling implications, one of which is that we've always tried to understand, for example, psychic phenomena, like how could I get information out of your head in my head, as some sort of signal going back and forth. But if we're organized, if we live in a universe that's organized holographically, you no longer have to tackle it that way. It could be that I have the entire universe and every neuron, every cell, every atom, every electron in my head, and you do also. So when we can access that, we can access information that seems to be beyond our normal sensory reach.
One of Talbot's most provocative claims, separation itself, is an illusion. If every part of the universe contains the whole, then the idea of being truly isolated, whether you're a particle or a person, simply falls apart. What looks like distance might just be part of a projection. Think of a hologram. Each tiny piece of the image holds information about the entire scene. Tear the hologram into pieces, and every shard still carries the same picture. Talbot suggested our minds could work similarly, not as separate islands sending signals, but as windows into a single, shared field that already contains everything. That changes how we think about telepathy or intuition. Instead of mysterious messages crossing space, these experiences could be moments when our mental filters loosen and we tap into the field that already holds all information. Under certain conditions, those filters relax, and phenomena we call paranormal might simply be glimpses of how reality is structured at a deeper level. If Talbot was right, boundaries between minds are temporary, not absolute. That idea doesn't just unsettle our science. It reframes how we relate to each other. Next, we'll explore experiments and personal reports that people point to as possible evidence. Want the deep dive? Hit subscribe and leave a question below.
Well, it also turns out that our brain uses Fourier transforms to translate visual information. This is a very unusual state of affairs. It's kind of like discovering Eskimos speaking Spanish. You know, it's not proof that the brain is a hologram, but it's suggestive that the brain is a hologram. And it turns out, in fact, all of our senses appear to rely on sort of Fourier transforms, that they all seem to use the same mathematics. So again, here's evidence that the brain uses the same mathematics to decipher the sensory world as are involved in the making of a hologram, which is, as I say, not proof, but compelling evidence that something is going on there.
Here's another piece of evidence pointing the same way. The math behind holograms shows surprising parallels with how the brain processes sight, sound, and touch. If that pattern holds, our nervous system might be working with holographic principles, breaking the world into frequencies and reconstructing it as the vivid reality we experience. That changes a lot. Perception wouldn't be a clear window onto an outside world. Instead, it becomes an active process of decoding a complex pattern beneath the surface. Our senses sample fragments of a bigger signal. The brain reassembles those fragments into the scene we call reality. It's not that the world disappears. It's that what we call the world is a reconstruction shaped by underlying rules we're only beginning to see. For Talbot, this wasn't only elegant theory, it came with direct experience. His work blended the math with field reports, altered state accounts, and practical experiments. That combination is what made his case compelling to some and controversial to others. Next up, we'll look at specific experiments and personal reports Talbot cited and ask whether they truly point to a holographic brain or if there are simpler explanations. If you want the deep dive, hit subscribe and drop a question below.
At a young age, I had an out-of-body experience where I left my body, and it became quite apparent to me while I was having this experience that I was thinking, but my brain was back in my body, which I could see in my bed. I knew it wasn't just a dream because I floated out over the ground outside my family's house, and I saw a book lying on the ground, and it was a book by the French short story writer Guy de Maupassant. And the next day, a neighbor said, "By the way, Michael, I lost a library book by Guy de Maupassant. Have you seen it?" And I thought, well, I floated over it last night. I didn't tell the neighbor that, but there was the book. And I was always I'm still very scientifically oriented. I want to understand the world in scientific terms. But it was really the first time that I sort of had to confront, the difference between my spiritual beliefs that we can survive, our bodily death, and this deeply held belief, scientific belief of mine that it's the brain that's doing the thinking. And I realized I had a kind of epiphany where I thought it isn't the brain that's doing the thinking. So I am not entirely certain that it's just the electromagnetic interference patterns that is the brain hologram, because those obviously would perish when the brain perishes. I think there might be some subtler level, some subtler energy that we haven't discovered with our technology that's involved in this also.
If thought can continue after the body stops, then the brain can't be the final source of consciousness. That's the logical nudge Talbot followed. Something else must be at work, a layer of energy, information, or order science hasn't yet detected. In plain terms, the body may be the vehicle, but not the origin awareness. If consciousness can persist, then death affects the body but not necessarily the mind that animates it. For Talbot, this wasn't a metaphysical leap detached from evidence, it was the start of an unavoidable conclusion based on the patterns he studied. That idea challenges mainstream views and raises tough questions. What would such a non-local mind look like? How would we test it? Skeptics demand rigorous proof. Proponents point to reports, patterns, and theoretical links. Either way, it shifts the conversation about life, death, and what we really are. Next, we'll explore the most cited experiments and near-death reports people use to argue consciousness survives the body and whether they hold up under scrutiny. Want the deep dive? Hit subscribe and leave a question below.
There's a device called a squid, which is a sort of electrical coil in which it looks like we may be able to demonstrate that the current, if you say which direction is the current going in the coil, it's going both directions at once, which is kind of an impossibility, but to simultaneously do that too is a quantum phenomenon, that these two realities are overlapping. So I think we will cross that barrier.
Experiments like this push the idea further. If an electrical current can flow into directions at the same time, then reality might not be locked into a single outcome. Different possibilities could exist side by side, overlapping, until something forces a choice. This isn't science fiction. These are lab results pointing to the same mind-bending conclusion. Our universe may hold multiple realities simultaneously, and if quantum systems can exist in overlapping states, it raises the question, could consciousness itself move between those layers? The implications go beyond the lab. If consciousness interacts with multiple realities, it could influence everyday life, decision-making, and even medicine, opening new ways to understand healing, perception, and the mind-body connection. Next, we'll explore experiments and real-world examples that suggest consciousness may be more flexible than we ever imagined. Subscribe and leave a question. Your curiosity might just connect to a new layer of reality.
In medicine, people have used this application of the holographic idea that we respond to the model of reality. Say this may be why we respond more to the placebos, to fake drugs. There's a very famous example of a fellow who had lymphatic cancer, tumors the size of oranges all throughout his body. His doctor basically thought he had about 3 days left to live. The fellow heard about a new drug called Crebiozin and said, "You've got to give this to me." And the doctor said, "Well, frankly, I don't think you have long to live, and this drug takes several weeks to take effect." He gave the man Crebiozin, and 3 days later, the man's tumors melted, as the doctor put it, like snowballs in a hot stove, completely gone out of his body, faster than the strongest radiation treatment could have melted them away. The man is up and around, walking around his hospital room, resumes his normal life, seems to be completely cancer-free. Several months down the line, he reads an article saying Crebiozin isn't that effective. Boom, 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 all his tumors come back. He's back in the hospital. The doctor starts to realize that maybe it wasn't the drug that cured the man, but the man's belief. So he lies to the man and he says, "Those articles are wrong. Crebiozin is effective, and in fact, I've got an even more potent version of it." He injects just salt water into the man's veins. Again, the man's tumors melt away. He resumes his normal life. Unfortunately, many months down the line, he reads final studies on Crebiozin saying it's completely ineffective. Boom, 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 his tumors come back and he dies.
Stories like this reveal something we often overlook. The body doesn't just respond to chemicals, it responds to belief. If the mind expects healing, the body can sometimes follow, even when the treatment itself is fake. That's the placebo effect. Talbot saw this as more than a curious trick. He saw it as a clue that consciousness isn't separate from physical reality. Instead, it actively shapes it. If expectation alone can shrink tumors or ease pain, then our model of reality isn't confined to our heads. It reaches into the body, into matter itself. The placebo effect stops looking like just a medical trick. It starts to look like evidence that belief, attention, expectation, consciousness can influence the physical world. Talbot argued that phenomena like this hint at the larger, interconnected, holographic universe he was exploring. Next, we'll examine more real-world experiments and examples where consciousness seems to bend reality itself. Subscribe and leave your thoughts. The mind may be more powerful than we realize.
One of the areas you had mentioned earlier, that one of the exciting things about the holographic idea is that people have taken this and explored all different realms. That some have used it to say this is how acupuncture works, because it turns out that there are little micro acupuncture systems where you can find the entire body in the acupuncture points of the ear.
Recapitulated
right
in the ear, yes.
Right. So that we've talked about the placebo effect. Some have said that the holographic idea applies in near-death experiences. One of these individuals is Kenneth Ring, who is at the University of Connecticut, studies near-death experiences. And it's interesting because in report after report of people who have been declared clinically dead, go to some apparent other level of reality and then come back, they refer to this other level of reality with terms like frequency and energy and even hologram, that it's a more plastic level of reality where thought seems to create things instantly. There are instances of people having near-death experiences where they think they're hungry and instantly food appears. Or perhaps an even better example, when people find themselves out of their body, there are cases where people look down and see that they're in a naked body and they go, "Oh my gosh, I'm naked." Instantly they have clothing on. Now, we don't assume that clothing has a soul, that it has a spirit that survives.
Near-death experiences take the conversation to a whole new level. People who go through them often report that their mind kept functioning even when their body had stopped. What they describe as an ordinary life. The world around them feels flexible, alive, almost as if it's responding directly to their thoughts. Time and space seem to bend, and consciousness appears unhindered by physical limits. Talbot looked at these accounts and said, maybe this is a small glimpse of how reality really works when the brain is no longer in the way. For him, these experiences weren't just stories, they were clues pointing to a deeper, more interconnected reality. Next, we'll explore experiments and patterns that might help explain these experiences scientifically. Subscribe and leave your thoughts. What do you think happens when the brain stops, but consciousness continues?
I very much believe that our soul lives many, many lives and goes through these things. And I think at this point in our development that we have manifested in the physical because we don't have a consciousness that's developed enough to deal with reality with its full grandeur and plasticity. That for us it would be very frightening if there weren't solid rules, if everything started to slip and slide. But I think as your soul goes along, it starts to learn to deal with more than this reality, with other levels on the holographic television set. And when you start to open those doorways, that's when reality, the plasticity of reality, starts to seep in. But then you go through a sort of shamanistic rite of passage, because you've got to go through, most people go, put an interpretation on it. They go, oh, this is an angel, or this is, a demon, or a UFO abduction. And if you do that, you're missing the basic lesson of shamanism, which is that everything that you experience in the non-ordinary reality of the shaman has psychological meaning for you. That you are entering a level of reality that responds so directly to your thoughts that your every thought helps what manifests. And in that instance, you can't ask what is there, but why have I created what is there? And I think that's the lesson that our souls are learning as we evolve.
As consciousness evolves, the rules of reality begin to loosen. We start to glimpse how flexible, even plastic, the world really is. That's why unusual experiences, visions, strange encounters, even reports of UFO abductions might not be what they seem. They could be the mind trying to interpret another layer of reality, one that responds directly to thought rather than obeying ordinary physical rules.
When you encounter something that is truly of another reality, your perceptions and trying to pull it out of this blur of energy and make it into a hologram don't quite know how to put it into form. And so I think that the reason there are many psychological motifs in UFO experiences is because there's something going on, but the surface appearance is a product of the person's own psyche.
In other words, a lot of what's going on in these various holographic realities are like ink blots.
Right. They can be interpreted like dreams as well, that they have psychological symbols in them.
Mm-hmm.
But they're also something real there, because UFOs can be tracked on radar. They leave circles, on the ground. They leave traces of physical evidence.
In Talbot's eyes, the universe wasn't a fixed machine. It was alive, layered, holographic, and deeply connected to consciousness. Death wasn't the end. Paranormal experiences weren't random. Even the strangest encounters could be glimpses of a deeper structure we're only beginning to notice. Talbot didn't live long enough to see how widely his ideas would spread, but the questions he raised remain as sharp as ever. What if reality isn't as solid as we think? What if our minds are part of a field far larger than we've been taught to believe?